Hello, History 101, MJC. Let's see here. I want to make sure that I give extra credit to everyone who's here. So is it
Hello.
Amanda Tellez?
Oh, we have more people today.
Good, good. Priscilla Sanchez. All right, Andrea Sierra. Great, great. All right. So anyone jumps in other than Amanda, Priscilla, and Andrea, let me know, okay? So I can give you your extra credit. All right. Thank you for being here. First of all, before we get into the content, we're going to cover basically numbers 20 through 30, and then also this week's argumentative assignment. Uh, Covering one, we'll cover the other. Are there any questions first?
Do you mean you're going to go over 1 through 30 for the next test?
Yeah, 20 through 30. Uh-huh.
Oh, 20 through
Yeah, so
30.
I feel like what we've done in previous videos and also what you've done on your argumentative assignments, we've already covered numbers 1 through 19
Okay.
on test two, okay? And I mean today, the week of the test, you could also ask me any questions you have on numbers 1 through 19. I'll be happy to help you. All right. So no questions so far. Amanda, anybody else? Okay. All right. So jumping into this, right? We're doing great man history. Remember, that doesn't mean that they think that the men are morally great that they're studying. It just has to do with causation. The great man historians believe that what caused this or that to happen when it comes to causation. They think that the best way of getting behind the reason for things is through studying those who are in positions of great power. Okay. And so Great Man History usually just does a lot of biographical information on the president and on the leading senators and congressmen and diplomats, etc. All right. So that's what we're doing in this assignment this week is we're putting focus upon Washington and the second president, John Adams, and the third president, Thomas Jefferson. All right. So with the first one, a common a common argument and theme and like discourse revolves around partisanship. Remember, to me, partisanship, right? I'm going to use it in a negative way that Washington meant it. It's the idea that, remember, if you are a faction, you're part of a faction. Remember, a faction is a group that shares the same beliefs and or the same self-interest, right? That if you're a faction, that it's almost all you care about, that you put the needs and the desires of your faction above not only that of and those of other factions, but even above what's best for the whole community, for the entire country. I would say the opposite of partisanship and being narrow and selfish like that, like what Washington, how he defined it, would be what the Romans called civic virtue. And with civic virtue, you could look back at a guy named Cicero, you could look back at a guy named Tacitus, and they were all about being absolutely selfless as a senator or a politician in ancient Rome. And do not worry about what you do for a living, what's best for your paycheck, but vote simply what's best for all of Rome and not just your personal faction. So we have quotes and we have behavior from Washington to suggest that that was his sentiment on the subject. He thought that Americans should be good, patriotic citizens and not just worry about the faction that they were part of. And so he was, I don't think it's too strong to say he was disgusted by the partisanship that sprang up during his administration. Okay, and so he served from 1789 to 1796. All right, the first two terms. And so let's get into that factionalism. All right. So firstly, a common argument is a lot of people will make a villain of Alexander Hamilton, and say that Alexander Hamilton, um, he alone did a lot to to incite, to provoke, and even to organize in opposition to him a liberal opposition, and which would become a liberal party. Because remember, when the liberals back then, they were the libertarians, right? They wanted government as small and unobtrusive into people's lives as possible. They wanted to err on the side of the republic being too democratic rather than too aristocratic or too monarchical with too heavy of an executive. And they were generically called anti-federalists by the opposition, and they put up a fight against the Constitution. They didn't think it was democratic enough, and that it was too centrally powered. But at any rate, during the administration of Washington, his two administrations, uh, they're going to form what we would call now a recognized political party. Because remember, nowhere in the Constitution did you or I see anything about a two-party system, right? That just organically developed, like a plant growing, right? So at any rate, with Hamilton, what did he do? Is first of all, right, is his goal. Um, his goal was not that of the liberals, and the means by which he went after that goal frightened the heck out of them. So, what was the goal? First of all, is as you see in chapters 6 and 7, Hamilton wanted he wanted us to become a self-sufficient giant as a country. He wanted us to develop all different types of industries, so to diversify economically, so that we would no longer ever be, again, dependent upon England or any other foreign country for that matter for our finished products and for our goods. He wanted us to make everything we needed here in the States. Okay. He also embraced what he thought was inevitable. He wanted us to urbanize, to develop big cities. He wanted us to, like I mentioned already, industrialize and diversify with different industries and the beginnings of mass production. He wanted us to commercialize. He wanted us to have commerce or trade from one region to the next and between our country and other countries, right? Sorry, guys. Um, let's see here. And so that was his goal, right? The means by which he wanted to do it frightened the opposition. So, for one, right, as a given, is he was for the government getting heavily involved in the economy to help bring this vision about. And remember, those who were kind of ideologues who read things in books and wanted to follow those Enlightenment ideas, those classical liberal ideas, like arguably Thomas Jefferson, Dickinson, Franklin, um, they had read their Adam Smith, his Wealth and Poverty of Nations, right? And he made it clear that the laws of psychology, the laws of human interaction, the laws of economics will prevail, and the government need not put its fingers in the economy. Let the economy do its own thing. All right. And so Hamilton wanting to get the government involved, they didn't like that theoretically right off the bat because that went against what Adam Smith had written in his Wealth of Nations book, which people consider kind of the the um, the prototypical description of a capitalist economy that is to be followed. But then also, what they didn't like is if the government gets too involved, if it gets too involved with big business in particular, right? It's going to form the politicians are going to develop a conflict of interest whereby they're going to do a kind of a quid pro quo system with big business. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And before you know it, the interests of the government leaders and of big business are intertwined and they become a common faction. And the word for that is a plutocracy, plutocracy. So the liberals were afraid of a plutocracy. They thought that could be the ultimate form of tyranny, to have this kind of oligarchy, right? A few leaders ruling at the expense of everyone else. And so they didn't like that, not one bit. And so some of the things he actually did seem to confirm their fears about this plutocracy. Is for one, He contended that the federal government was going to take the formal obligation of paying the state's debts. Now, you on face value, right? You're South Carolina and you're far in debt. Uh, by all means, right? Federal government, bail us out. But the thinking back then, right, that they were getting from the Scottish liberals like Gordon and Trenchard and these other guys that Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were showing to this people in the states here, is that what the government does for good today, right, and as far as getting its nose into someone else's business, it could do for harm tomorrow. So that was a fear, right? A reticence that the states' rights libertarians felt. It's like, wait a minute, why does the federal government want to get its claws into the state debts? We think because so that they could help control their budgets, right, in the future. So then, in addition to that, um, they wanted to subsidize, right? They wanted to economically support and help certain industries that they felt were vital. We do this to this day as an American political tradition. But the idea is, right, is that that Hamilton argued is when someone gets his hands on either dad's money or a loan and has that money to begin with in a business, no, just technically, right, just capital. When someone gets his hands on capital, he is theoretically going to choose the road of least resistance and the quickest, easiest profitability, right? So, what about fast forward into the 1840s? What about railroads? Railroads were super expensive. A myriad of railroad companies went under before they could even finish their tracks and charge a single person for freight or passenger um, charges. And so the government says we need to make it worth their while to build railroads. So we'll make them a promise, right? Are you offline? Call mom, okay? Call mom first. I'm sorry, guys. We have a my wife and I are both teachers, and my wife had to run to school, and my boy is just got kicked offline from his Zoom with his second grade teacher. So at any rate, what a time, right? This COVID time. Um, so where was I? I apologize. Subsidizing business, but who is going to even have the beginnings of the means to build a railroad? A big corporation with a lot of capital to begin with. So the government comes in and says, okay, we'll make it worth your while if you decided to go the railroad route, because we think railroads would be good for the whole country, right? So every mile of track you lay, this starts in the 1840s, by the way, in the future, but the precedent had already been established by Hamilton, that will give you 12 acres of free land along the sides of that mile of trackage. And so that's what they would do, is they would give tax breaks, they would give land, they would give money, um, they would give bond certificates to give an incentive for people to start new industries so that we could diversify as a country. And as the case with railroads, right, to build infrastructure like the skeletal foundation of the economy, connecting one region to another, right? And so again, though, in subsidizing these new industries, they tended to oftentimes be wealthy businesses that were getting these subsidies. And so it smacked of a plutocracy, right? Then also, where's the money going to come from subsidizing these railroads, et cetera, later on, these new factories, et cetera? The government has to come up with that, especially being in debt right off the bat. So for one, Hamilton started in exacting taxes, right? But the irony here, the president is elected by the electoral system, not by direct vote. He handpicked Hamilton as a secretary of treasury. Hamilton's giving taxes to the people, amongst them, ironically, a tax on tea. Remember, with the British. Our House reps had never given their okay to these taxes. And in the Constitution, as you may remember, in Article 1, it says all taxes, right? Any legislation for a new tax must originate in the House of Reps. Uh, again, in line with our idea that it's taxation by permission, by consent. And Hamilton's going away from that. And then also bonds. A bond certificate, when you purchase one, states basically that you are lending money to the government, and the government, of course, to make it worth your while, promises you not only to be paid back, but to be paid back with a decent interest rate so that you can make money off the government. Again, who has the extra money to buy bond certificates and to lend money to the government? The wealthy. So a lot of the bond holders were wealthy men. Okay. So again, this looked like Hamilton was forming a plutocracy with the rich. Um, and then also the US Bank. If you'll notice, under Article 1 with Congress, under Article 2 with the executive, which was making this bank, you'll find nothing in there that states they have a right to form a national bank. Okay, it's not in there. But he formed one nevertheless. And a certain percentage of the governing board were private bankers, kind of like the later Federal Reserve, and a certain proportion of them were government leaders. Okay, and so the government put its own funds in there, but also connected to other private banks. But what didn't change the fact is that it was primarily government run, this U.S. bank, right? So it goes to the Supreme Court. The liberals are furious and they're frightened, and they say, "How could Hamilton do this?" Right? And so when Hamilton, his lawyers defended, is they used a necessary and proper clause. Remember that at the bottom of Article 1, Section 8 from your last assignment? It says, whatever is necessary and proper to carry out anything on that enumerated or specifically stated list of powers given to Congress can be carried out. So to a libertarian, the necessary and proper clause is scary, right? Because it's almost like a blank check saying that where they could greatly enhance their own powers by saying, well, it's not on the list, but we deem it to be necessary and proper because we can do this, this, and this. So as you could imagine, the necessary and proper clause was applied to regulating interstate trade, which is on that list, right? Of course, taxing and giving import and export taxes is on that list, right? Of course, making an incentive-based system with inventions, patents, that is, that's on that list. And they said in order to do those things on that list, it's necessary and proper to create a national bank. And the Supreme Court, which was very conservative, agreed with him, and it came into being that was okay. So all this frightens the liberals, right? That Hamilton is betraying the spirit of 1776, the height of the influence of the Enlightenment, and is bringing us back to an old England, okay? Because England had a national bank and bonds and subsidized industries, etc. So it looked like we were going back the route of England, whom we had broken from. And then also remember the Whiskey Rebellion. He puts a tax on whiskey, and thousands of farmers who were using their corn and wheat stock to ferment into alcohol as a business on the side, they opposed paying these taxes. And it literally turned into a rebellion. And so then the federal government sent in an army larger than the army ever was under the Continental Army against the British. So how ironic is that? And so they sent an army of 13,000 soldiers to squash this rebellion. And then the rebels stepped down and there was no fight. But still, to the liberals, right, this was too much. The government was becoming tyrannical, too friendly with big business, too centrally strong, government way too involved in the economy, etc. All right, so are there any questions on that?
No.
Okay, good. Anybody else? All right, so note, right? When this happens, James Madison is going to switch sides. The quiet conservative guy that member said that reps should be filters for the foolish ideas of their constituents who voted them into office. that the central government needs to be much stronger than that of the states, right? This conservative Madison switched sides, became so disenchanted with the conservatives. And then, not to mention, another polarizing factor between the left and right at this time was the French Revolution. And when England began fighting against Napoleon and his, quote, revolutionary army, the liberals sided with France and the conservatives sided with Great Britain. And so the administration of Washington, although it declared neutrality, um, if you look at Jay's treaty, we kind of sucked up to the British and accepted subservient terms to them and did not do so with the French. And so the liberals, that's one more thing the liberals were angry about. All right. But then to Washington, you had the National Gazette, you had the Aurora, some of these big newspapers with thousands of readers and subscribers. They were very anti-administration. They made fun of George Washington. They tried to almost kind of instill fear in the population that Washington and Hamilton were betraying the revolution and going backward, taking the clock backward to make us like England. And so Washington was furious over this. He was a sensitive guy, especially when it came to his wounded pride, but he let it happen nevertheless, right? A guy named Citizen Genet, it was kind of like the Bolshevik Revolution. Everyone was comrade this, comrade that. Citizen was an egalitarian term, that it's no longer going to be the Marquis of this, the Duke of that, but everyone is citizen, whatever your last name is. So this Jacobin representative calling himself Citizen Genet came and gave a tour, did not meet with Washington deliberately, and went on a tour trying to get Americans to support the French Napoleonic army and spreading by force the French Revolution throughout Europe. And Jefferson toured with him. And Washington was furious about this because he had declared neutrality and he didn't want anyone provoking the American population into taking a side. So while this happens, right, Washington, he abided by their First Amendment rights. He allowed them to do such. He also began the tradition of press conferences, which you don't find in the Constitution, but open press conferences that were not necessarily scripted, so that reporters could ask him questions to be more accountable. His famous 2 p.m. walks, people could come and shake his hand and meet him and ask him questions, etc. So Washington, he tried to allay the fears of the left, right, of the liberals, and saying, hey, I'm not a monarch. People can criticize me. While I'll recognize freedom of the press, I'll be accountable through these press conferences and these daily walks. He gave goodwill tours, right? Remember, at the time of the Confederation, he relinquished his sword when the fighting was done and said, I'll never become a military tyrant like Julius Caesar did, right? When he won in Gaul and brought that army back to Rome and used his own army against fellow Romans, his political opponents. So that was a great fear in the left, and he kind of assuaged that fear. Religious toleration, he was big on that. He has a famous quote to a Jewish community in New York, telling them that they'll be entitled to all the rights and freedoms of citizenship as will have anyone else. And so he tried to alleviate the fears of the left, and he tried to convey himself like a father figure who was frustrated that his two sons kept fighting each other, right? His proverbial liberal son and his conservative son. So he tried to make it look as if he was above the fray, right? But to the liberals, they were furious because the very fact that he gave such a long leash to Alexander Hamilton and allowed him to inaugurate that economic system to a lot of people was enough to confirm to them that he truly was a conservative. And if that didn't do it, Whiskey Rebellion, him sending a huge army against his own people, right? That was another moment. And then also Jay's treaty with England, being very favorable to England. So by the time his second administration, his second term had finished, I don't think you can go so far as to say it would be questionable if he could have won a third election, but he definitely did not have the height of popularity that he had enjoyed 8 years prior to that. Okay. And so then moving on to the second president. All right. So that's what you're looking at as far as number one on the argumentative assignment, and numbers 20, 21, 22, 23 on the test. Okay. So then starting with number 24, John Adams administration, right? John Adams is depicted by David McCullough as being a very independent minded, stubborn, but yet virtuous man. John Adams, for instance, amongst all the presidents, was one of, for certain, by his own admission, one of the most vocal Christians of our presidents, for instance. And so with John Adams, with McCullough, as he's arguing in his biography, why Adams only won one term. He's our first one-term president. As the second president, he loses re-election to Jefferson. So why is that? McCullough turns it into a boast. Instead of highlighting what he did wrong, he highlights what he thought was morally right, but yet backfired on him politically. So to McCullough, politics is not about having a conviction to which you stand consistently, unfortunately, to McCullough. He would like that to be the case, but he says the reality of it is it's not. Politics is about about aligning yourself with strong. Um, oh, bless you, Amanda. That's okay. You still get full credit. Thank you for letting me know. Um, so politics to McCullough is about allying yourself, you as well, hon, allying yourself with strong allies and towing the line with them. That it doesn't matter if you agree with what your allies think, if you think their decisions are the ethically right decisions to make, it doesn't matter. You need to ally yourself with them and pragmatically go along with the party. To McCullough, John Adams was too good of a man to do that. He had too much integrity. He was too bent on doing the right thing in every single decision that faced him, rather than just seeing what was the popular thing and what his political party was for. And so, in being independent minded, John Adams alienated himself from both the left and the right. And that's what caused him, says David McCullough, to lose re-election. All right. So, how did he lose the left? Well, that was easy. Firstly, he was a part of the wrong party, right? He was a Federalist, like Hamilton. Remember, the Federalists had said very arrogant things against the common people, saying the republic ought to be more aristocratic than it is democratic because the common people are ignorant, they're rash, they'll follow their basic instincts and their selfish desires without thinking things through. So John Adams already had made that reputation for himself as kind of a snob against democracy. When he came in, he made it clear that he was absolutely disgusted with the French Revolution. Because remember, the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Thomas Jefferson literally traveled to France and helped write the Declaration of the Rights of Man with French revolutionary leaders. So to Thomas Jefferson and the liberals, the French Revolution took our revolution, which supposedly emanated largely from the Enlightenment, and they carried it out more successfully, more thoroughly, right? They took it to its logical conclusion. And but to John Adams, he hated the fact that the use of violence, for instance, when the Gironde lost control of the French Revolution and it went to the Jacobins instead, the Jacobins basically declared class warfare against the nobles. And they began beheading people infamously, right? By the thousands, by the tens of thousands, simply for being noblemen. So, I mean, literally, you're getting killed because of the class, the economic class you were born into. To John Adams and the conservatives, that was way too radical. That was nothing they were willing to even entertain as a possibility to do against England when we had fought for independence. Also, the Enlightenment was very anti-established religion. And so pretty soon, the Jacobins declared year one of reason because they wanted to take France off the Gregorian calendar, right? Anno Domini, year of our Lord, like right now, 2020, supposed to be roughly 2020 years after the birth of Christ. They wanted to start a new calendar. They shut down the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and they dedicated it to I want to say Aphrodite, or one of the goddesses of reason from the Greco-Roman times. They began arresting and beheading Catholic priests. And so, to John Adams, as an Adamite Christian, he thought literally the French Revolution had entered the realm of the influence by Satan, by the devil, by the Antichrist. So he was absolutely he abhorred the French Revolution, and he made it clear because he was a very honest guy. And so that alienated the left clearly. Then he's not in war, right? But he raises a navy, and he has them do a 2 times a year convoy system where they basically protect and babysit our private merchants as they went to go trade in Europe. Because the problem was, is Napoleon's navy, the British did as well, would confiscate American goods and take them from them because they were trying to blockade their enemy and keep them from receiving any products. And so that was in violation of our international rights as a neutral nation to serve with to trade with either side, as long as it was not war materiel, right? Weaponry of any sort. So the French were violating that. And so with this convoy system, he gave the okay to his navy that if any French frigate tries to stop and bully one of the merchant ships, you can fire upon them. So it became known as the almost or quasi war with France. But notice under Article 2, does it say anywhere that the president has that power to do that? To send troops somewhere and have them actually fight before Congress has raised an army, before Congress has declared war? No, of course not. You won't find it. So to the left, this was unconstitutional. And then to make matters worse, John Adams, his Congress, his Federalist Congress, passed the Alien and the Sedition Acts. With the Alien Act, Congress had been given the power to determine policy on immigration and deportation. Congress gave that power to the president. So remember, if you're a liberal, that is frightening. The checks and balances in the Constitution are there to prevent tyranny from any group. Why in the world would one group, given a power in the Constitution, just relinquish it and give it over to another branch? So the Alien Act, right, was designed because ever since Citizen Genet had come, Jacobin and French revolutionary clubs proliferated throughout this country in support of the French Revolution. So this Alien Act gave him the power, President Adams, to deport any, quote, French radicals, French immigrants that are here like Citizen Genet, to stir up trouble and to get us to fight with Napoleon's army. Then the Sedition Act stated basically that if your expression, whether it be written or verbal, if your expression in any way um, goes against our neutrality and provokes Americans to fight with France and enter this fray, right? Or to oppose anything as far as foreign policy that the federal government is up to, that becomes now illegal. So that's a curtailment, that's a cutting short, that's a limitation his Congress put on our First Amendment rights. So the left hated this, right? And one of the first things he did that really alarmed the left is the guy with the National Gazette newspaper, a French immigrant named Philip Freneau. He had him arrested under this Sedition Act. And so people said, look, he's abusing his power now, taking away First Amendment rights and simply arresting his enemies for writing ill of him in their newspapers. How did he alienate the right? Okay, so clearly he was no friend of the left, but his own party on the right? No pun intended. Firstly, right, he would not ask Congress to go to war against revolutionary France. In fact, he sent a pro-French ambassador to France to end this quasi-war and to come to terms of peace with France and stay neutral like Washington had us. The right was furious over this because they wanted us to get involved and make sure that Napoleon's army did not win in Europe. Also, there was something called Fry's Rebellion. And I don't have time to get into it, but he basically gave a speech. And in the midst of that speech, people engaged in violent acts against the police that tried to break up the rally. And some people died. Some police officers did. So the right wanted Mr. Fries to be executed, kind of like the Whiskey Rebellion, to make a statement to people like, hey, we don't have a Confederacy anymore. Those old Shea rebellions are not going to be tolerated by our government. We're going to squash dissent. But John Adams, having been a lawyer for years, looked into the facts and said, you know what? Mr. Fries never explicitly told anyone to engage in violence against the authorities. So technically, he's not responsible and shouldn't be held responsible for those deaths. And so hence, he pardoned him. And those on the right were furious. And then also Haiti or Santo Domingo, the African slaves engaged in an insurrection in the 1790s. And at one point, they had virtually killed or chased out of the island every white Frenchman. And they established a black republic of ex-slaves under a guy named Levertois. And so at any rate, the conservatives, as well as the liberals, because remember, a lot of the libertarian liberals were from the South and they were okay with slavery. He recognized this republic and said, basically, good for these African slaves. They could show the world that black people can form a republic also. And not to mention, he was an abolitionist. And so he alienated people on the right for being for black rights. Okay, that was his personal conviction. And then also his personality. He could not stand Alexander Hamilton, and he let it be known. He couldn't keep it to himself. He thought Hamilton was way too vain, way too self-centered, and he thought most of his actions were power grabs and cries for attention, and that he made it about himself rather than serving the republic. And Hamilton was a powerful enemy to make in his own party on the right. So hence he loses re-election. Are there any questions on that one? All right. Okay, so let's go to the last subject here, okay, for this week's assignment, and that is Jefferson. Now, Jefferson, a man riddled with contradictions, right? Jefferson was brought up, according to Richard Hofstadter, was brought up like he was a nobleman. His mother, Jane Randolph, was of high Scottish ranking nobility. Because of her name and bloodline alone, he was given pretty much automatic access to the best tutors, to the best universities to study in, and also to the handpicked Royal Council in Virginia, simply on account of his mom and her family name under Great Britain. His dad was a commoner. His name was Peter Jefferson. People wrote well of him as far as his personality, his character, his work ethic, but he was a commoner. And his mom married down, marrying him. So under the English laws of coverture, Peter Jefferson, this commoner, grabbed all the property of his wife, Jane Randolph, when they married. That was the very patriarchal law coming from English political tradition. Well, to assuage the anger of his in-laws, Peter Jefferson said, why don't we just continue to live together? We'll stay in the same home, and we'll share the resources, right? To try to kind of gloss things over. Supposedly, according to Hofstadter, it did not work. It was to no avail. The mother and father-in-law of Peter Jefferson, the maternal grandparents of Thomas, did not cease to harass and humiliate him in his own home, saying that their daughter should have married someone wealthier and better. Okay. Then you add to that dimension that Thomas Jefferson was constantly trying to gain his father Peter's affirmation. He wanted to work with him on the plantation, get his hands dirty with his dad. And his dad, on multiple occasions, was said to have pretty much told his son, I don't want you to have to work with your hands. Use your mom's name. Use that Randolph name and go get the best education you could possibly get, which of course is what he did, right? So Thomas Jefferson, in many ways, had an upbringing and continued to have a lifestyle of an aristocrat. He never really had to work, um, much less with his hands. He had more than ample leisure time to read all the books that he wanted and ruminate on intellectual and political subjects. He constantly had parties, dinner parties, where people would come and they would drink the finest of wine and they would talk about books they had read and different intellectual topics. Because, like the book states, Jefferson was kind of a Renaissance man. He read up on and tried to experiment in a myriad of different fields and subjects. And so, despite this lifestyle, right, when he becomes president, he tries to make it very clear that he is a common man of the people. The way he dressed, dishevelingly in the White House, the way that he gave himself open access in Washington, D.C., and allowed poor neighbors to come and dine with him, the way he would go on walks and visit poor neighbors and sometimes sneak meat into their stew, um, and give them anonymous gifts. To Hofstadter, he thinks that it was uh, a um, a psychological repression instinct, that Jefferson was so angry with the arrogance of his mother and of his, particularly of his mother's mother, and the way they treated his father. He hated the airs that they had, the arrogance and sense of entitlement that they had, and he wanted to win over his dad and gain his dad's respect and affirmation. So Hofstadter thinks he was compensating and trying to convince himself, trying to convince his dad, and trying to convince his voters that he was no aristocrat, but he was a common man. So that, as if he kind of had wealth guilt. And so, at any rate, in his overtures, he made it clear that he was for the people. He was for the republic being more democratic than anything else, right? But again, when you look at his view of the republic being democratic, he was the first to admit in debate with John Adams and others that he thought giving the vote to the common people of his generation was like putting a kid behind a vehicle without driver's training, that they largely were going to make some foolish decisions. But he said what needed to be done is there needs to be a crusade against ignorance and have a public school system and educate the citizenry with a good classical and enlightened education. Then they'll be prepared to rule themselves. And so, looking at Brinkley's book, right? What does he state about the fact that Jefferson didn't do hardly anything that he claimed he was going to do before he became president? So, one, this enlightenment of the public. Look in your chapter quiz this week, and you'll find that gains in education were very small and unimpressive. Um, Two, Hamilton system. The left thought that Jefferson was going to get rid of Hamilton's system when he became president, right? Get the bank out of there, end federal subsidy, stop the bond movement, and all that. And Jefferson's Secretary of Treasury did an investigation and came back to Jefferson and said the system is too ensconced into our institutions. Too many farmers have loans from this federal bank. Too many industries are dependent upon the subsidy. Too much infrastructure is literally in the middle of being built, and we don't want to just scratch it and have that money go to waste. And so, hence, we need to grudgingly allow Hamilton's system to continue. That it was a sense of like inevitability, that we're already going down Hamilton's road. There's no stopping it, so there's no use in trying to stop it. That's kind of Brinkley's thesis, right? And add to that thesis the fact that you find in Jefferson someone who was very, very non-confrontational in his personality, very bashful, very shy, very timid, When Washington and others became angry with him, he couldn't handle it emotionally. Um, but yet, in some ways, almost deviously passive aggressive. When he was away from people, how what he would write about them with his pen and actions he would partake in to sabotage the conservatives when they weren't looking. And so, at any rate, he keeps Hamilton's system alive. Education didn't do too much. Then slavery. He had written in the notes on the state of Virginia, which became published, his own private notes and his correspondence with a French friend. He had written very disparagingly of slavery. In particular, he said that slavery makes sycophants of the slaves. Remember, a sycophant, um, uh, Sycophant, is someone who's at the mercy of someone else, and that person by nature, by circumstances, has to become dishonest, submissive, and deferential, have no will or mind of his or her own, because they don't have that luxury because they're under the arbitrary power of someone else. And he said a sign of slaves having to become sycophants is when masters have sexual relationships with their black slave women, because what is the black woman going to say? How could she really be honest? She's in a helpless situation. So, at any rate, how ironic that he had 140 something slaves. He never freed them up to his death. He bequeathed them to his daughter, to one of his daughters. Um, he also had a romance with Sally Hemings, a beautiful slave that was given to him from his father-in-law, and marrying his wife who had died in childbirth, with Sally Hemings. He brought her to Paris on multiple occasions with the notion that they were more progressive there. They were more accepting of black and white integration or miscegenation. And but yet, when they came back to Virginia, he would not publicly take a stand for his relationship with Sally. And they had about 4 biracial kids. And the oldest one, Beverly, was so furious that he had gone back on his word to free Beverly at the age of 18 that Beverly ran away and was never seen again by him, as far as I've read. So he was not willing to take a stand publicly against slavery. And also, what was terrible are his writings about Africans. While he thought Native Americans were inherently biologically born with the same talents and proclivities as white people, that their being, quote, savage was just circumstantial. That if they were taken from their culture and environment and assimilate to the white man's culture, they could succeed just as well as the white man. He did not say that about African Americans, nor, ladies, about women. He felt like each group was inherently or biologically um, not as intelligent, not as self controlled, not as strong as far as emotional and mental makeup. And so he kind of adhered to that Sambo image of African Americans, SAMBO, the happy go lucky, ignorant slave who lacked self control and intelligence and couldn't handle freedom if you gave it to him. All right. So again, we're looking at the hypocrisy here. Then he was against unauthorized wars, right? Uh, like the quasi war with John Adams. Because remember, the libertarians were strict constructionists. They believed that the president and Congress, the Supreme Court, can only do what the Constitution explicitly states they can do, and they can do nothing else in addition to it, because they wanted to keep everyone's power limited, right? Well, nowhere in the Constitution again did it state that Thomas Jefferson could send a guy with the last name of Eaton, Eaton, to go to the Tunisia, North Africa, and try to raise an army with American government funds and overthrow the Basha, the Muslim governor under the Sultan there in Tunisia and Tunis, and put his brother Ahmed on the throne instead of the brother Yusuf. But he did. That's exactly what he did. Nothing states that he could send a ship called the USS Philadelphia, a naval ship, to go and fight and punish this Basha Yusuf for the piracy he was endorsing in the Mediterranean Sea and North African coast. No one gave him the right in Congress to do that, but he did it anyway. And so it's going to result in the Tripolitan or Barbary Coast War, where he's going to send Marines and others to fight against the Basha of Tripoli in Muslim North Africa because of their extortionate practice of piracy. They were stopping American ships and taking everything they had, taking those on the ships for ransom and selling them in the slave market, either in Tunis or in Istanbul. And so Jefferson had enough and he acted unilaterally on this. But the Constitution didn't say he could do that, right? And so that's another way in which Jefferson contradicted himself when he was president. Then also, he was a strict constructionist, and nowhere in Article 2 does it say the president can buy land from a foreign country, right? And if you've done the quiz already, or I'm assuming you will, you'll read about the Louisiana Purchase and how Livingston and Monroe, his ambassadors, bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon in France. Well, he did that without Congress being involved. And then after the fact, asked Congress to ratify it, saying, well, I have the power to make treaties, and technically I bought it and signed it as a treaty. And so it worked. It worked. But again, it was kind of a power grab by Jefferson, which is ironic. And then also, in purchasing that land, Napoleon said, on one condition, you are to give my French inhabitants in Louisiana the full rights of citizenship, right, under your country. And so Jefferson signed and said yes, but he didn't do it. He instead split the Louisiana Territory north and south under literally 21 handpicked men. There was no democracy allowed. He put them in territory status and said when they apply for and receive statehood status, then the Constitution and constitutional rights will apply to them, but not before then. And his rationale is that the French inhabitants had not lived under self-government in the past, under the Rome French government or Spanish one as it went back and forth, and that they were not ready for self-government. And also he felt like because them being French, that some being Spanish, many being indigenous or Native American, right, that they could not be trusted as far as their loyalty to the new American flag. So that's another ironic thing he did. And then before Napoleon had even bought the Louisiana Territory, Jefferson sent several military and clerical leaders on expeditions to the far west to check this territory out. And the most famous, of course, was Lewis and Clark with the famous Sacagawea Native American woman, right? And so with about 4 dozen men and women, they went across the country. But note, while Meriwether Lewis, he gave a lot of information that Jefferson was curious about as far as the flora and fauna, the animal and plant life, the geography, the rivers to take, and as far as making a map for good routes for future Americans to travel. Clark, however, right, kept in his diary about the numbers of each tribe that they came across, whether that tribe could be basically bought or bribed by certain commodities that they showed interest in, and whether or not they may likely put up a fight against the American government and settlers in the future, and what their strength was in numbers and weaponry, etc. So my point being is in these expeditions, right, one could make the argument that they were kind of imperialistic. Remember, imperialism is where you impose your will upon a separate sovereign people without their permission. It's as if he's spying on this land, planning to take it, right? And needing to know ahead of time, who do I need to worry about? Who can I buy off? Who do I have to fight against, etc. And literally when they would come to the tribes, Clark would tell them greetings from your great white father, President Jefferson. So he tried to implement that type of paternalism, like I am your boss. Because remember, in the Constitutional Convention, they decided that the quote Indians were a nation within the nation under direct control of the federal government. All right. So any questions on that? All right, well, I think that's finally it, you guys. If there aren't any other questions, we've gone through the argumentative assignment, and we've also gone through numbers 20 through 30 on your next test. So then next week, you'll have the War of 1812 video assignment, and the following week, you'll have test 2. So again, feel free to contact me via Canvas Messenger especially. And if there aren't any other questions, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Again, I'll give extra credit to those of you who are here today. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'll see you next week, okay? All right, I'll see you later.